Before we begin, I ask for your support. Subscribe to the channel so I can keep bringing you these untold stories of the famous. The Australian sun was merciless that morning in 1979, beating down on the cracked asphalt of the abandoned highway outside Broken Hill. I could feel the heat radiating through the windshield of the Interceptor even before I turned the key, the black leather seats already burning to the touch despite the early hour. The smell of hot metal and gasoline filled the cramped cockpit as I adjusted my position behind the wheel. Right then, Mel, George Miller's voice crackled through the radio, mounted hastily to the dashboard. This is the money shot. The studio's breathing down our necks, and we need this sequence to be absolutely spectacular. What the crew didn't know at that moment was how desperate our situation had become. We were 3 days behind schedule and hemorrhaging money on a film that most industry insiders predicted would sink both George's directing career and my acting prospects. The pressure wasn't just creative, it was financial survival dressed up as artistic vision. I pressed the radio button. Copy that, George. Just remember what we discussed about the safety margins. There was a pause. When George's voice came back, it carried that edge I'd been hearing more frequently as our budget evaporated in the outback heat. Mel, mate, we've been through this. Marcus knows what he's doing with the other vehicle, and Jimmy's got the camera angles mapped out perfectly. The plan seemed straightforward enough. I would drive the Interceptor at high speed down this stretch of abandoned highway, while Marcus Webb, in a modified pursuit vehicle, would attempt a overtaking maneuver that would create the illusion of a near collision. What made it dangerous was the speed required, over 90 miles per hour, to achieve the visual effect George wanted. Later, Marcus would admit he'd been having doubts about his reflexes. At nearly 50, he'd started questioning whether he still had the split-second timing that had made him Australia's most sought-after stunt driver. But on that morning, with cameras rolling and money burning, none of us were willing to voice our concerns out loud. Positions, everyone. George's voice crackled through the radio. Mel, bring it up to cruising speed. Marcus, hold your position until he hits the first marker. I pressed down on the accelerator, feeling the modified V8 engine respond with a throaty roar. The speedometer needle climbed steadily, 60, 70, 80. The highway stretched ahead like a black ribbon cutting through the harsh landscape, heat waves rising from the asphalt. What I didn't know was that the front left tire had been purchased from Sydney Wrecking Yard. In newer rush to keep costs down, someone had made a decision that would nearly cost me my life. The tire looked fine on visual inspection, but its internal structure had been compromised by thousands of miles of previous use, and the combination of extreme heat and high speed was creating conditions its supply wasn't designed to handle. First marker coming up, Mel. How's she handling? The Interceptor felt solid enough, though I was beginning to notice subtle vibrations through the steering wheel. At normal speeds, it would have been barely perceptible. At 90 miles per hour, even small irregularities became magnified into potential catastrophe. She's holding steady at 90. I reported back, not mentioning the growing sense that something wasn't quite right with the car's handling. Excellent. Marcus, you're cleared for approach. In my mirrors, I watched the pursuit vehicle accelerate, closing the gap between us with frightening speed. This was where trust became everything. Trust in Marcus's abilities, trust in the mechanical reliability of both vehicles, trust in George's assurance that the safety margins were adequate. The sound of Marcus's engine reached me even over the roar of my own, a deeper note that seemed to harmonize with the Interceptor's mechanical symphony. He was keeping his vehicle perfectly positioned, just close enough to create the dramatic effect George wanted, but not so close as to actually endanger either of us. Or so we thought. Looking good from camera one, Jimmy's voice joined the radio chatter. The angle's perfect. We were getting everything. But the vibrations in the steering wheel were getting stronger. What had started as a barely noticeable tremor was developing into a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to sync with the rotation of the front wheels. I found myself having to make constant minor corrections to keep the Interceptor tracking straight down the highway. George, I said into the radio, trying to keep my voice steady. I think we might have a tire issue. She's starting to pull left. Static filled the air for a moment. Then, Can you compensate? It was the kind of question that in retrospect seems loaded with terrible significance. Could I compensate? Probably. Should I try? The smart thing would have been to abort the sequence, check the tires, and try again later. But we'd already spent hours setting up this shot, and every delay meant more money bleeding away into the desert heat. I can handle it, I heard myself say, the words coming out before I'd fully considered their implications. What none of us realized was that the tire wasn't just losing air, it was beginning to separate internally. The used tire's compromised structure was failing under the stress of sustained high-speed driving in extreme heat. Crew members later described seeing small pieces of rubber debris appearing behind the interceptor, but at the time, everyone assumed it was just road surface kicked up by the speed. "Marcus, you're cleared for the overtaking maneuver." George's voice came through the radio with a kind of finality that suggested there would be no second chances. "Make it count. We're not likely to get another shot at this today." The pulling sensation was getting worse now, requiring real effort to keep the car straight. My arms were beginning to ache from fighting the steering wheel, and beads of sweat were running down my face despite the morning hour. In my peripheral vision, I caught a glimpse of Marcus positioning himself for the approach that would bring his vehicle within inches of mine at nearly 100 miles per hour. The radio had gone quiet except for occasional bursts of static. Everyone was holding their breath as 12 vehicles hurtled toward a carefully choreographed dance that was about to become something far more dangerous than any of us had anticipated. Marcus began his approach, his pursuit vehicle pulling alongside us with the precision of a man who'd spent decades calculating the exact distance between spectacular and suicidal. I could see his face through his side window, etched with the kind of concentration that comes from knowing that the slightest miscalculation would turn movie magic into real tragedy. The vibrations in the steering wheel were intensifying with each passing second. What had started as a minor handling issue was rapidly developing into something that threatened to overwhelm my ability to maintain control. The interceptor wanted to drift toward the left shoulder of the highway, and it was taking everything I had to keep us tracking straight. But we were committed now. Marcus was already alongside us, matching our speed with the kind of precision that made him one of the best in the business. The cameras were rolling, capturing what everyone hoped would be the defining sequence of Mad Max, the moment that would transform a low-budget Australian film into something that would revolutionize action cinema. None of us knew that we were about to film something far more authentic than we'd bargained for. The tire that had been purchased from a wrecking yard was reaching the final moments of its structural integrity, held together by nothing more than steel belting and prayer. In seconds, it would fail completely, transforming a controlled stunt into an uncontrolled disaster that would test whether skill and luck could overcome the fundamental laws of physics at 90 miles per hour. The Australian highway stretched ahead, empty and unforgiving, while Marcus and I raced toward Arendesvis with forces neither of us fully understood or controlled. The tire exploded at 93 miles per hour. Not gradually, not with warning. One moment I was fighting the steering wheel to keep the interceptor straight. The next I was wrestling with 2 tons of metal that had suddenly developed its own malevolent agenda. The sound was like a gunshot amplified through a megaphone, a sharp crack that cut through the engine noise and radio chatter with the finality of breaking bone. The car lurched left with such violence that my hands were nearly torn from the steering wheel. The world outside became a kaleidoscope of spinning asphalt, and sky as fragments of rubber exploded around us like black confetti. Through the chaos, I caught a glimpse of Marcus's face. No longer the controlled concentration of a professional stunt driver, but the wide-eyed shock of a man watching physics take control of a situation that was supposed to be choreographed. Jesus Christ. Marcus's voice cracked through the radio. The first time in 20 years anyone had heard him break his professional calm during a stunt. The interceptor was sliding sideways now, the destroyed tire creating a pivot point that sent the rear off the car, swinging toward Marcus's pursuit vehicle. At these speeds, the laws of momentum became absolute. There was no stopping what had been set in motion, only the hope that skill and reflexes might be enough to prevent complete catastrophe. Camera operator Danny Walsh later described the moment as watching two bullets collide in slow motion. Through the viewfinder, you could see it all happening frame by frame. Mel's car going sideways, chunks of tire flying everywhere, Marcus yanking his wheel hard right to avoid the collision that looked inevitable. Like watching a plane crash from the inside. I pulled the steering wheel as hard as I could to the right, trying to compensate for the drag of the shredded tire, but the Interceptor had entered that terrifying realm where driver input becomes merely a suggestion rather than a command. The car's trajectory was now being dictated by forces far beyond human control. Friction, momentum, the fundamental mathematics of disaster unfolding at highway speeds. Marcus was good, better than good. In the split second after my tire exploded, he made 3 decisions that saved both our lives. First, he yanked his wheel right, throwing his pursuit vehicle into a controlled skid that carried him away from the Interceptor's sliding trajectory. Second, he hit his brakes in a precisely calculated manner that brought his speed down without locking his wheels and losing control entirely. Third, he somehow managed to miss the shower of rubber debris that was erupting from my disintegrating tire, like shrapnel from a roadside bomb. "I've got you, Mel," he shouted into the radio, though later he'd admit he had no idea what he meant by that. There was nothing either of us could do except ride out the physics and hope that 60 years of combined driving experience might count for something in the face of mechanical failure at lethal speeds. The crew watching from the camera truck experienced their own version of hell. Assistant Director Peter later admitted he was certain we were both about to die. The Interceptor was completely sideways, throwing up this massive cloud of rubber and smoke. Marcus's car was skidding alongside it, and for a moment they were so close you couldn't see daylight between them. I started composing the press release in my head, 2 killed on Mad Max set. I genuinely thought I was watching a double fatality. Script supervisor Helen Morrison had grabbed the radio and was screaming for medical assistance before anyone even knew if we'd been hurt. Emergency crews. Emergency crews. We have vehicles out of control on the highway. Her voice, captured on the production audio that survived, carries the kind of terror that comes from watching disaster unfold in real time. The Interceptor's slide seemed to last forever, but probably took less than 5 seconds from the moment the tire exploded to the moment we came to rest. I fought the wheel throughout, not really controlling the car so much as negotiating with it, trying to influence its path toward the least catastrophic outcome possible. The shoulder of the highway rushed toward us, then past us, then toward us again as the car fishtailed in a series of violent corrections. Meanwhile, Marcus was performing his own desperate dance with disaster. His pursuit vehicle, caught in the chaos of our mechanical failure, was sliding sideways across the asphalt in a barely controlled skid that took him within inches of the Interceptor's spinning mass. Later analysis of the footage would show that at one point, the 2 vehicles came within 8 inches of each other, close enough that Marcus could have reached out his window and touched the Interceptor's door handle. I could see Mel through his windshield, Marcus later recalled. His face was completely focused, no panic, just this intense concentration as he fought to keep the car from rolling. But I also knew that if we touched, if our vehicles made contact at those speeds, we'd both be dead. There's no surviving a collision at 90 miles per hour. The physics of our near disaster were being captured by 4 different cameras, though none of the operators fully understood what they were filming until later. What they thought was a controlled stunt sequence was actually genuine automotive chaos. 2 vehicles locked in a dance-off destruction that could have ended in fatalities broadcast to millions of future moviegoers. Sound engineer Mike Trent was monitoring the radio frequencies when the tire exploded. The first thing you heard was this tremendous bang through Mel's radio, then Marcus swearing, which he never did during stunts, then this awful scraping sound as the Interceptor's rim hit the asphalt. But what stayed with me was the silence afterward. For maybe 10 seconds, nobody said anything. We were all processing what we just witnessed. The Interceptor finally came to rest in a cloud of dust and smoke about 200 yards from where the tire had failed, facing backward on the highway shoulder with steam rising from the overheated engine. The pursuit vehicle had managed to stop about 50 yards further down the road, Marcus's superior driving skills having allowed him to maintain some semblance of control throughout the chaos. For a moment, the only sound was the tick of cooling metal and the whisper of settling dust. Then George Miller's voice crackled through the radio, tight with a mixture of relief and barely suppressed panic. "Mel? Marcus? Talk to me, boys." I keyed the radio with a hand that was surprisingly steady. "We're alive, George. Banged up, but alive." Marcus's response came a moment later, his professional calm already reasserting itself, though there was a tremor in his voice that hadn't been there before the stunt began. "Both vehicles stopped safely. No injuries. But, Jesus, that was close." What followed was controlled chaos. Emergency vehicles that had been staged nearby as a precaution race to our position, medics swarming over both cars to assess any potential injuries. Fire crews deployed foam around the Interceptor's engine compartment, which was running dangerously hot after the abuse it had endured. Police officers began documenting the scene, though their reports would later be heavily sanitized to protect the production's insurance claims. Producer Byron Kennedy arrived at the scene within minutes, his face grim as he surveyed the wreckage of what should have been a simple stunt sequence. Later interviews with crew members revealed that Kennedy's first words weren't about our safety, but about the production schedule. How long before we can shoot again? Dr. Sarah Phillips, the set medic, examined both Marcus and me for signs of shock or injury. Physically, they were fine, she later reported. But I could see it in their eyes. That look people get when they've just realized how close they came to dying. Gibson kept flexing his hands, like he couldn't believe he still had feeling in his fingers. Marcus was quieter than I'd ever seen him, just staring at his car like he couldn't quite process what had happened. The destroyed tire told its own story. When mechanics examined the wreckage, they found evidence-safe catastrophic structural failure. The kind of breakdown that occurs when already compromised materials are pushed beyond their absolute limits. The tire had been doomed from the moment we'd accelerated past 80 miles per hour. The only question had been when it would fail, not if. That tire shouldn't have been on any vehicle, let alone one doing high-speed stunts, mechanic Tony Barrett later admitted. The internal cords were already separating, the sidewalls were cracked, and the tread was worn down to the steel belting in places. We got that tire from a wrecking yard for $30. It nearly killed 2 people. But even as the full scope of how close we'd come to disaster became clear, the pressure to continue filming intensified. The production was burning money at an unsustainable rate, and every hour off delay pushed Mad Max closer to the kind of budget overrun that kills careers and bankrupts small production companies. George Miller gathered the core crew for a meeting while medics were still checking us over. "What can afford to stop?" he told them, his voice carrying the desperate edge of a man watching his dreams slip away. "We reshoot the sequence with a stunt double. We finish the picture, and we pray what we captured today is usable." But as the adrenaline began to fade and the reality of what had happened sank in, a different kind of tension settled over the production. We had just filmed an authentic near-death experience. 2 vehicles genuinely out of control, 2 men fighting for their lives at 90 miles per hour. It was exactly the kind of visceral authenticity that George had been pursuing, but achieved through actual mortal danger rather than carefully controlled illusion. You could see it in everyone's faces, makeup artist Linda Chong recalled. They were excited and terrified at the same time. We got in the shot, but at what cost? And if we were willing to risk people's lives for one sequence, what would we be willing to do for the next one? As the sun climbed higher over the Australian highway and the emergency crews began to clear the scene, I found myself staring at the scattered remains of the tire that had nearly killed us both. Each piece of shredded rubber represented a moment when physics could have chosen death instead of survival, when the mathematics of momentum could have written a very different ending to the Mad Max story. The cameras had captured everything. Every moment of genuine terror, every split-second decision that had saved our lives, every frame of authentic automotive chaos that no amount of special effects could replicate. It was cinematic gold, bought with blood and luck in equal measure. But as I stood there in the desert heat, watching the crew pack up their equipment and prepare for a next shot, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had crossed a line from which there might be Northern. The pursuit of authenticity had led us into genuinely dangerous territory, and the fact that we'd survived this time was no guarantee that we'd be equally fortunate in the future. The highway stretched ahead, empty and unforgiving, while somewhere in the distance, George Miller was already planning the next sequence that would push us even closer to the edge of disaster. The silence on set the next morning was different from the usual pre-dawn quiet. Crew members moved with deliberate care, their conversations muted, equipment handled as if it might explode without warning. The Australian sun rose over the same stretch of highway where Marcus and I had nearly died, but the landscape felt changed somehow, marked by the invisible scar of what had almost happened. I arrived at the location an hour earlier than call time, unable to sleep and unwilling to sit alone in my hotel room with my thoughts. The Interceptor sat in the equipment area, its front end raised on jacks while mechanics worked to replace not just the destroyed tire, but the entire wheel assembly that had been damaged in the blowout. The twisted metal told the story of forces no human body was designed to survive. "Morning, Mel." Tony Barrett looked up from his work, his hands black with grease and his face grim. "She'll be ready to go in an hour, but I gotta ask, are you sure you want to get back in this thing?" It was a fair question. In the 36 hours since the tire exploded, I'd had plenty of time to consider whether Mad Max was worth dying for. The rational answer was obvious. No movie, no matter how revolutionary George claimed it would be, was worth risking my life. But rationality had never been me strong suit, and walking away would mean admitting that I'd been broken by a mechanical failure in a few moments of genuine terror. "I'm fine, Tony," I heard myself say, though my voice carried less conviction than I'd hoped. "Just make sure those tires are properly inspected this time." The mechanic nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He'd been working film sets for 15 years and had seen plenty of actors lose their nerve after close calls. The smart ones usually found excuses to use stunt doubles for the dangerous sequences. The stupid ones pushed ahead out off pride and often ended up seriously injured or dead. Marcus Webb arrived shortly after, moving with the careful precision of a man whose confidence had taken a beating. For 20 years, he'd been the guy other stunt performers came to when they needed someone to attempt the impossible. But the highway incident had revealed something that shook him to his core. Even the best driver in Australia could be rendered helpless by mechanical failure at 90 miles per hour. "How are you holding up?" I asked as he inspected his pursuit vehicle, running his hands along the bodywork like a doctor checking for broken bones. "I keep thinking about those 8 inches, he replied without looking up. 8 bloody inches between a spectacular stunt and a double funeral. That's not skill, Mel. That's just luck. And luck runs out. Set photographer Jamie Collins had been developing the film from the previous day's near disaster. "The sequence looks incredible," he told anyone who would listen. "Genuinely terrifying. You can see the exact moment when everything goes wrong. Watch both cars sliding toward each other. It's the most authentic action footage I've ever seen." But authentic wasn't the same as safe, and the crew was beginning to understand the difference. Gaffer Rick Morrison later admitted that watching the rushes had been like viewing footage of his own friend's near execution. You're watching it thinking, Christ, they could have died. Not might have been hurt. Not could have been injured, died. Dead. Gone. And we were all complicit in setting up the situation that nearly killed them. The production meeting that morning was tenser than usual. George Miller sat at the head of a folding table set up in the shade of the camera truck, his face showing the strain of a man trying to hold together a vision that was rapidly consuming everyone around it. Producer Byron Kennedy sat opposite him, a stack of insurance reports and budget projections spread before him like evidence on a criminal trial. "The footage is spectacular," George began, his voice carrying forced enthusiasm. "Jamie's right. It's the most authentic car chase sequence ever captured. The audience will feel like they're in the car with Mel, experiencing every moment of genuine danger." Kennedy cut him off. "The insurance company is threatening to pull coverage. They've classified yesterday's incident as a preventable equipment failure resulting from inadequate safety protocols. If we have another accident like that, They'll cancel our policy and shut down production immediately. It was one tire. George shot back, his famous temper beginning to flare. One defective tire that slipped through inspection. We've upgraded all our equipment, double-checked every vehicle. It won't happen again. But script supervisor Helen Morrison had been making notes, and her observations carried weight with the crew. George, that tire didn't just fail randomly. It failed because we're pushing everything, vehicles, equipment, people, beyond their safe operating limits. We're filming car chases at speeds that would be dangerous on a racetrack, let alone a public highway with minimal safety equipment. The room fell silent. Morrison had voiced what many crew members were thinking but had been afraid to say. That George's pursuit of authenticity was edging into recklessness, and yesterday's near disaster was proof that they were operating in genuinely dangerous territory. Assistant Director Peter, where had spent the night reviewing safety protocols for the remaining action sequences. We've got 3 more major stunt scenes to film, he reported. Each one involves high-speed driving, close proximity vehicle maneuvers, or both. If we're going to continue, we need to seriously discuss using stunt doubles for the most dangerous elements. The suggestion hit George like a physical blow. His entire vision for Mad Max was built around the idea that audiences would know they were watching real people in real danger, not carefully concealed doubles performing sanitized stunts. Using doubles would compromise the authenticity that he believed would set the film apart from every other action movie being made. Stunt doubles will destroy the film's credibility, George argued, his voice rising. Audiences can tell the difference between real and fake. They can sense when an actor is genuinely afraid, when the danger is authentic rather than manufactured. That's what will make Mad Max revolutionary. The knowledge that what they're seeing actually happened. Kennedy leaned forward, his patience clearly wearing thin. George, what actually happened yesterday was that we nearly killed 2 people for a movie. A movie, not a war, not a rescue mission, not saving lives, entertainment. How do you justify risking people's lives for entertainment? The question hung in the desert air like an accusation. Around the table, crew members shifted uncomfortably, many of them asking themselves the same thing. They'd signed on to make a low-budget action film, not to participate in some kind of cinematic Russian roulette where mechanical failures could turn movie magic into genuine tragedy. Cinematographer David Egby had been unusually quiet throughout the meeting, but now he spoke up with the authority of someone who'd been filming dangerous sequences for over a decade. I've worked with the best stunt coordinators in the business, and they all say the same thing. The moment you start chasing authenticity for its own sake, people get hurt. The goal isn't to create real danger. It's to create the illusion of danger while keeping everyone safe. But that's exactly the problem, George replied, his voice carrying the fervor of a true believer. Audiences are too sophisticated now. They've seen every special effect, every carefully choreographed stunt. They can sense when something is fake, when the danger isn't real. Mad Max has to be different. It has to be authentic. Marcus had been listening to the debate with growing frustration. Finally, he stood up, his weathered face grim with determination. George, I've been doing stunts for 20 years, and I've never had a problem with authentic danger. But what happened yesterday wasn't authentic danger, it was genuine chaos. When equipment fails at 90 miles per hour, skill and experience don't matter. It becomes pure chance whether people live or die. The meeting broke up without resolution, the crew dispersing to their various tasks with an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before the highway incident. Some sided with George's vision of revolutionary authenticity, excited by the possibility of creating something genuinely groundbreaking. Others worried that they were participating in a production that valued cinematic impact more than human safety. Makeup artist Linda Chong later described the atmosphere as like working in a family that's been through a traumatic event. Everyone was still functioning, still doing their jobs, but there was this underlying fear that it could happen again. And next time, we might not be so lucky. I spent the afternoon walking the highway where the tire had exploded, trying to process what I'd experienced and what it meant for the remainder of filming. The skid marks were still visible on the asphalt, dark rubber streaks that told the story of two vehicles dancing with disaster at lethal speeds. Standing there in the desert heat, I could almost hear the echo of that explosive sound, feel the steering wheel jerking in my hands as physics took control of the situation. The truth was that I was scared, not just of getting back into the Interceptor for another high-speed sequence, but of what George might ask us to do next. His vision of authentic action cinema was becoming increasingly extreme, and yesterday's near disaster had only seemed to reinforce his belief that genuine danger was essential to creating genuine excitement. While I returned to the production area, I found George huddled with storyboard artist Steve Wong, planning the next major action sequence. The drawing showed a complex multi-vehicle chase involving the Interceptor, two pursuit vehicles, and a tanker truck, all moving at high speeds through a series of coordinated near collisions that would require split-second timing and absolute precision. This will be the centerpiece of the film, George was explaining, his enthusiasm evident despite the day's tensions. The sequence that defines Max as a character and establishes the world's dangerous reality. We'll need perfect weather, perfect timing, and drivers who are willing to push their vehicles to the absolute limit. Looking at those storyboards, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening. The sequence George was planning made yesterday's highway run look like a leisurely drive in the countryside. If a single tire failure could nearly kill Marcus and me during a relatively simple overtaking maneuver, what would happen when multiple vehicles were involved in a choreographed dance of destruction? As the sun set over the Australian outback, casting long shadows across the highway where we'd almost died, I realized that the real test of Mad Max wasn't going to be whether we could create revolutionary action cinema. It was going to be whether we could survive the process of creating it. The Interceptor sat ready for tomorrow's filming, its new tires gleaming in the fading light like promises that might or might not be kept. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear George still discussing plans with his crew, his voice carrying across the desert with the certainty of a man who believed that great art required great sacrifice. What none of us fully understood yet was just how great that sacrifice might ultimately be. 3 engines, 300 horsepower, 120 miles per hour. The tanker truck filled my rearview mirror like a wall of death, its massive chrome grille reflecting the Australian sun into my eyes with the intensity of a laser. Behind the wheel, stunt driver Jack Morrison was fighting to keep 18 wheels of unstoppable momentum tracking straight as we rocketed down the highway in a formation that defied every principle of safe driving ever conceived. This was George Miller's masterpiece of mechanical madness. 3 vehicles locked in a deadly battle at speeds that turned human reaction time into a meaningless concept. The Interceptor, Marcus' pursuit car, and Morrison's tanker truck, all moving in precise formation while cameras captured every moment of what everyone secretly believed would end in multiple fatalities. Tighter formation. George's voice crackled through the radio over the thunder of engines. I need them closer. The audience has to feel like they're watching real death. Real death. The words hung in the superheated air of the Interceptor's cabin as I watched the tanker's massive front bumper growing larger in my mirrors. We were already closer than any sane person would consider safe, but George's vision demanded more. Always more. The pursuit of authenticity had become an addiction, and we were all enablers feeding his need for increasingly dangerous highs. Marcus was running parallel to the tanker's passenger side, his pursuit vehicle dwarfed by the truck's massive bulk. Through his side window, I could see his face, not the calm concentration of a professional anymore, but the tight-lipped determination of a man who'd accepted that he might die in the next 30 seconds and was resolved to make it count. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its execution. The tanker would overtake both the Interceptor and the pursuit car, creating a moment where all 3 vehicles would be traveling abreast at over 100 miles per hour with less than 6 feet separating us. The cameras, positioned at strategic points along the highway, would capture the sequence from multiple angles to create the illusion that Max was being hunted by forces beyond his ability to control. But illusion and reality had blurred beyond recognition. What George had choreographed as a carefully controlled stunt had become something far more dangerous. A high-speed dance with genuine death where the slightest miscalculation would result in an explosion of twisted metal and burning fuel that would make headlines around the world for all the wrong reasons. The tanker began its overtaking maneuver. Morrison downshifted, and a massive diesel engine responded with a roar that seemed to shake the highway itself. 18 wheels of fully loaded truck began to accelerate past the interceptor, the vehicle's enormous mass creating wind currents that buffeted my car like a toy in a hurricane. The sound was overwhelming, not just the engine noise, but the whistle of air being displaced by surfaces never designed to move at these speeds. Camera operator Danny Walsh, positioned in a chase vehicle half a mile ahead, later described what he saw through his viewfinder as like watching a train wreck happen in slow motion. Except the train was moving 120 miles per hour, and there were people inside, all the cars. I could feel the interceptor being pulled toward the tanker's massive bulk by aerodynamic forces that threatened to overcome my ability to maintain control. The steering wheel vibrated in my hands as scompeting air currents tried to tear the car from my grasp and sent it spinning under the truck's rear wheels. Every instinct screamed at me to brake, to fall back, to escape the killing zone that was rapidly forming around the tanker's moving mass. But we were committed now. The cameras were rolling, capturing footage that would either revolutionize action cinema or document the moment when George Miller's vision finally consumed the people trying to realize it. Marcus was having his own battle with physics. The pursuit car, caught between the tanker and the interceptor in a space that was rapidly shrinking, was being hammered by conflicting wind currents that made steering almost impossible. Later, he would describe the experience as trying to thread a needle while riding a bucking horse in an earthquake. "This is insane." Marcus's voice cut through the radio static, the first time anyone had heard him openly question a stunt sequence. "George, the wind shear is too much. I can't hold position." But George's response carried the fervor of a man watching his greatest artistic vision unfold in real time. "Hold the formation. This is exactly what we need. The audience has to see the vehicles fighting for survival." In the camera truck, script supervisor Helen Morrison had grabbed the radio microphone and was trying to call off the sequence. "George, abort. Abort the stunt. They're too close." But her voice was lost in the chaos of multiple radio frequencies and the overwhelming noise of 3 vehicles pushing the boundaries of mechanical possibility. Sound engineer Mike Trent was monitoring all the radio channels simultaneously, and what he heard convinced him that he was about to record the audio track of a multiple fatality. Mel's breathing wascoming in short gasps, like he was hyperventilating. Marcus was swearing continuously under his breath, which he never did during stunts. And Morrison in the tanker was completely silent, which was somehow more terrifying than if he'd been screaming. The tanker was now fully alongside both cars, its massive bulk creating a moving tunnel of wind and noise that threatened to tear apart anything caught in its wake. I could see Morrison through the truck's side window, his hands locked on the steering wheel in a death grip as he fought to keep 18 wheels of momentum tracking straight at speeds no tanker was ever designed to handle. That's when the first tire blew. Not on the interceptor this time. One of the tanker's rear duals exploded with a sound like artillery fire, sending fragments of rubber spinning through the air like shrapnel from a roadside bomb. The truck lurched violently to the right, directly toward Marcus's pursuit car, as Morrison fought to maintain control of a vehicle that had suddenly developed its own malevolent agenda. "Jesus Christ!" Morrison's voice cracked through the radio, all professional calm shattered by the reality of losing control of a fully loaded tanker at highway speeds. "I'm losing it. I'm fucking losing it." The tanker's massive rear end began to slide sideways, the destroyed tire creating a pivot point that sent tons of metal and fuel swinging toward the pursuit car like a wrecking ball. Marcus had perhaps 2 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether he lived or died, brake and risk being crushed by the tanker's trailer, or accelerate and hope he could outrun the destruction bearing down on him. He chose acceleration. The pursuit car shot forward like a rocket, its engine screaming as Marcus pushed the accelerator to the floor in a desperate attempt to escape the tanker's killing trajectory. But the truck was everywhere now, its massive bulk filling the entire roadway as it began the kind of spectacular jackknife that had killed countless truckers on highways around the world. Camera operator Jamie Collins, filming from a helicopter circling overhead, captured the moment when all three vehicles seemed to occupy the same space simultaneously. Through the camera, it looked like they were going to be crushed, he later recalled. The tanker was sliding sideways across both lanes. Mel was trapped on the left, Marcus was trying to escape on the right, and there was nowhere for anyone to go. I was watching my own death unfold in real time. The tanker's trailer was sliding toward the interceptor with the inevitability of an avalanche, its massive bulk blocking out the sun as it bore down on my position. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. At these speeds and angles, there was no way to avoid a collision that would crush the interceptor like an aluminum can. Time dilated into that strange, slow-motion state that people describe in moments of mortal crisis. I could see every detail with perfect clarity. The terror on Morrison's face as he fought the wheel, the spray of rubber debris from the destroyed tire creating a black cloud around the tanker. Marcus's car pulling ahead in a desperate race against physics and geometry. My hands moved without conscious thought, yanking the steering wheel hard left toward the highway shoulder. The interceptor responded instantly, dropping two wheels off the asphalt and onto the gravel margin with a violence that threatened to tear the steering wheel from my grip. But it was working. The car was sliding away from the tanker's path, using the loose gravel as a cushion that might absorb enough momentum to save my life. Behind me, I could hear Marcus's engine screaming as he fought to clear the tanker's front bumper. The pursuit car was pulling ahead, but slowly, so slowly that each second felt like an hour. The tanker jackknife was accelerating now, its trailer swinging across the highway with increasing speed as Morrison lost all semblance of control. "Oh God! Oh God! Oh God!" Morrison's voice was a continuous prayer transmitted over the radio to everyone watching the disaster unfold. The tanker was completely sideways now, blocking both lanes off the highway as it slid toward the guardrail with the momentum of a runaway freight train. The interceptor hit the highway shoulder, doing 90 miles per hour, gravel and debris exploding around the car in a storm of dust and flying rocks. The world outside became a brown chaos of dirt and vegetation as I fought to keep the car upright while it bucked and skidded across terrain never designed for high-speed travel. Somewhere behind me, Marcus's pursuit car cleared the tanker's front bumper with inches to spare, the vehicle shooting past the jackknifing truck like a bullet escaping a gun barrel. Later analysis would show that he'd missed being crushed by less than 3 feet, close enough that he could have reached out his window and touched the tanker's chrome grille. The tanker hit the guardrail doing 80 miles per hour. The impact was tremendous, a sound like the world ending that could be heard for miles across the desert. The guardrail, designed to stop passenger cars, offered no meaningful resistance to 18,000 pounds of truck and trailer moving at highway speeds. Steel posts snapped like twigs, and the entire assembly disappeared beneath the tanker's bulk as the truck burst through the barrier and plunged down the steep embankment beyond. Morrison rode the truck all the way down, fighting the wheel even as the tanker rolled and tumbled through the scrub brush like a gigantic aluminum tumbleweed. The sound of grinding metal and shattering glass filled the air as tons of machinery came apart in a spectacular display of destruction that would have been beautiful if it hadn't involved a human being trapped inside the chaos. I finally brought the interceptor to a stop in a cloud of dust and flying debris, the car's engine ticking and cooling as silence fell over the highway for the first time in what felt like hours. My hands were shaking as I keyed the radio, my voice barely above a whisper as I tried to assess the scope of the disaster we'd just survived. "Morrison? Jack? Talk to me, mate." Silence. Then, incredibly, a voice crackling through the static-filled radio. "I'm alive. Truck's totaled, but I am alive. Jesus, that was close." Marcus's voice joined a radio chatter, tight with shock but functional. Pursuit car stopped safely and no injuries. But Christ George, that was too fucking close. Around the highway, emergency vehicles were already converging on the scene, their sirens wailing across the desert as firefighters and paramedics raced to assess the damage and treat any injuries. The tanker lay on its side at the bottom of the embankment, diesel fuel spreading across the sand in a dark stain that marked the spot where we'd all nearly died for George Miller's vision of authentic cinema. In the camera truck, George Miller sat in stunned silence, watching playback footage of the most spectacular and terrifying stunt sequence ever captured on film. The cameras had recorded everything: the tire explosion, the jackknife, the three vehicles dancing with death at speeds that transformed human skill into irrelevant suggestions in the face of pure physics. "My God," he whispered, his voice carrying a mixture of horror and awe that would haunt everyone who heard it. "We actually filmed it. We filmed genuine automotive chaos. No special effects, no camera tricks, just real vehicles and real people in real danger." But the cost of that authenticity was written in the wreckage scattered across the desert floor. The tanker was destroyed, Morrison was shaken but alive, and 3 careers had just been forever altered by an encounter with the thin line between cinematic vision and genuine catastrophe. As the sun began to set over the Australian highway, painting the crash scene in shades of red and gold, we all understood that something fundamental had changed. We had pushed the boundaries of filmmaking beyond safe limits and somehow survived to tell the story. But we had also learned that a pursuit of authentic danger eventually leads to authentic destruction. The highway stretched ahead, empty and unforgiving, while behind us the wreckage of our ambition smoldered in the desert heat. The silence that followed was different from any quiet I'd ever experienced. Not the peaceful calm of a finish day's work, but the hollow emptiness that comes after surviving something that should have killed you. The Australian highway stretched away in both directions, unmarked now except for the dark stain of diesel fuel that would remain on the asphalt for months, a memorial to how close we'd all come to becoming statistics rather than storytellers. 3 days had passed since the tanker crash. The wreckage had been cleared, the emergency vehicles had departed, and the film equipment had been carefully packed away while insurance investigators swarmed over every piece of metal and rubber, looking for someone to blame for what everyone privately acknowledged was a miracle of survival rather than a failure of planning. I sat in my hotel room overlooking the desert, staring at rushes from the tanker's sequence that George had delivered with the reverence of a man presenting sacred artifacts. The footage was extraordinary, possibly the most authentic action sequence ever captured on film. You could see the exact moment when Morrison lost control of the tanker, watch the massive truck begin its deadly slide across the highway, feel the terror radiating from 3 vehicles locked in a dance with genuine death. "It's cinematic gold," George had said when he dropped off the film canisters, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and something else, guilt, perhaps, or the hollow satisfaction of an addict who'd finally achieved the ultimate high. No special effects house could create what we captured. No stunt coordinator could choreograph that level of authentic chaos. The audience will know they're watching something real. Real. The word had lost all meaning for me. What was real? The carefully planned stunt sequence that existed on paper, or the catastrophic mechanical failure that had nearly killed 3 people? The controlled illusion of danger that audiences expected, or the genuine terror of watching a jackknifing tanker truck bearing down on you at 80 miles per hour. Marcus had left the production the morning after the crash. No formal resignation, no dramatic confrontation with George. He simply packed his gear and drove away into the desert, leaving behind 20 years of stunt work and a reputation that had been built on his willingness to attempt the impossible. When I called his hotel room to check on him, the desk clerk told me he'd checked out at dawn, leaving behind only a note for George that read, "Some lines shouldn't be crossed." Later, I would learn that Marcus never worked on another film set. The man who had been Australia's premier stunt driver spent his remaining years teaching defensive driving courses to suburban housewives and corporate executives, as far from the world of high-speed cinema as he could manage. When reporters asked him about Mad Max in later interviews, he would simply say, "We were lucky. Luckier than we deserve to be." Jack Morrison, the tanker driver who had ridden 18 wheels of destruction down an embankment and somehow walked away, had a different reaction to his brush with mortality. Within a week of the crash, he was back on set, ready to attempt whatever dangerous sequence George dreamed up next. But something fundamental had changed in him. Where once he'd been methodical and cautious, now he drove with the reckless abandon of a man who'd already cheated death once and figured he was living on borrowed time anyway. Jack became addicted to the edge, cinematographer David Egby later observed. The tanker crash should have scared him straight, but instead it convinced him that he was invincible. It was like he'd survived something that should have killed him, so now nothing could touch him. It made him incredibly valuable as a stunt driver and incredibly dangerous as a human being. Morrison would go on to work on dozens of action films, becoming legendary for his willingness to attempt stunts that other drivers refused. But his luck ran out 7 years later on the set of a forgettable action sequel, when a carefully planned car chase went wrong in ways that no amount of experience could overcome. The crash that finally claimed him was far less spectacular than the tanker sequence. Just a simple miscalculation at 60 miles per hour that sent his car rolling into a concrete barrier. But everyone who'd been on the Mad Max set knew that Jack Morrison had really died that day in the Australian desert, and everything afterward was just borrowed time finally coming due. The crew that remained struggled to process what they'd witnessed and participated in. Some, like camera operator Danny Walsh, spoke of the tanker sequence with the awe of men who'd been present at the creation of something genuinely revolutionary. "We captured lightning in a bottle," Hugh would tell anyone who would listen. "No computer graphics, no camera tricks, just real vehicles and real people in real danger." It changed what action cinema could be. Others were less sanguine about their achievement. Script supervisor Helen Morrison, who tried desperately to call off the tanker stunt as it spiraled out of control, submitted her resignation 3 days after the crash. "I got into filmmaking to tell stories," she wrote in her letter to George, "not to enable the systematic endangerment of human life in service of entertainment. What we did wasn't brave or artistic. It was reckless, and the fact that everyone survived doesn't make it any less wrong." Producer Byron Kennedy found himself caught between commercial reality and moral responsibility. The footage from the tanker sequence was undeniably spectacular, the kind of visceral authenticity that would set Mad Max apart from every other action film of its era. But the cost of achieving that authenticity, the near deaths, the psychological trauma, the dissolution of his production team, left him questioning everything he thought he knew about the business of making movies. "We created something extraordinary," Kennedy later reflected, "but we nearly destroyed ourselves in the process." The question became, was it worth it? And I'm still not sure I know the answer to that question. George Miller himself seemed most affected by the psychological aftermath of the tanker crash. The director who had pushed relentlessly for greater authenticity, more dangerous stunts, closer brushes with genuine mortality, suddenly found himself confronting the reality of what his vision had nearly cost. He would complete Mad Max, but his approach to action sequences changed fundamentally after that day in the desert. George became obsessed with safety protocols after the tanker crash, assistant director Peter Weir recalled. Not in a way that compromised the action, but in a way that acknowledged the difference between controlled danger and genuine chaos. He'd gotten what he wanted, the most authentic action footage ever captured, but the price had been higher than he'd anticipated. In his private moments, George struggled with the duality of his achievement. The tanker sequence would become the centerpiece of Mad Max, the sequence that critics would point to as evidence that action cinema had evolved beyond the safe, sanitized stunts of previous decades. But it had been purchased with genuine terror, authentic near-death experiences, and the psychological fracturing Ophi's production team. "I watched the rushes over and over," George later admitted, "and every time I saw that tanker sliding toward Mel's car, I felt sick. Not because the footage wasn't spectacular, it was everything I dreamed of capturing, but because I knew how close we'd come to filming actual death rather than cinematic illusion. And I wasn't sure the difference mattered anymore. For me, The aftermath was more personal and perhaps more complicated. The tanker sequence had given me something that no acting class or dramatic role ever could, a genuine encounter with meow mortality, captured on film for millions of future viewers to witness. There was something both terrifying and exhilarating about knowing that audiences would be watching me fight for my life in real time, that the fear and determination they saw on screen was absolutely authentic. But it had also fundamentally altered my relationship with the craft of acting. Every subsequent role felt somehow diminished, lacking the genuine stakes that had made Mad Max so viscerally real. How do you go back to pretending to be in danger when you've actually stared death in the face and somehow survived? How do you manufacture dramatic tension when you've experienced the real thing at 90 miles per hour on an Australian highway? Mel was never quite the same after Mad Max, observed makeup artist Linda Chong, who worked with me on several subsequent films. Not in a bad way, necessarily, but in a deeper way. He'd experienced something that most actors never do, genuine mortal terror while the cameras were rolling. It gave him a gravity, an authenticity that you can't fake or teach. But I think it also left him always searching for that same level of real stakes in his other work. The film itself, when it was finally completed and released, became exactly what George had envisioned. A revolutionary action movie that redefined what audiences expected from car chase sequences. Critics praised its visceral authenticity, its unflinching portrayal of vehicular violence, its ability to make viewers feel like they were experiencing genuine danger rather than carefully choreographed entertainment. What they didn't know, what none of them could have known, was the price that authenticity had extracted from everyone involved in creating it. The tanker sequence that became Mad Max's signature moment had nearly claimed 3 lives, psychologically scarred a dozen crew members, and forever altered the way everyone involved thought about the relationship between art and risk. In the years that followed, the Mad Max franchise would spawn sequels, imitators, and countless articles analyzing its influence on action cinema. George Miller would go on to direct other films, but none would require the same level of genuine physical danger that had defined the original. The pursuit of authenticity that had nearly consumed us all became a cautionary tale within the industry, a reminder that some lines between reality and illusion should never be crossed. But on quiet nights, when I found myself driving alone down empty highways, I would sometimes remember the weight of the steering wheel in my hands as the interceptor fought to escape the tanker's deadly trajectory. I would recall the sound of Morrison's prayer crackling through the radio, the sight of Marcus's pursuit car threading between tons of sliding metal, the moment when genuine terror and cinematic gold became indistinguishable from each other. The highway stretched ahead, empty and unforgiving, while behind me the ghost of burning rubber whispered that some stories are worth telling, no matter what they cost to capture. But in the darkness beyond my headlights, I could still hear the echo of that tanker's diesel engine, still see the spray of debris from the destroyed tire, still feel the weight of knowing that authentic cinema sometimes requires authentic sacrifice. Mad Max had survived. We had all survived. But the desert had claimed something from each of us that could never be recovered. The comfortable illusion that movies were just make-believe and that cameras would always stop rolling before anyone got seriously hurt. The empty road stretched on into the night, and somewhere in the distance, the ghost of George Miller's voice whispered through the darkness. We actually filmed it. We filmed genuine automotive chaos. And in that whisper was both triumph and tragedy, both achievement and loss, both the birth of a legend and the death of innocence. The highway had no answers, only the endless promise of distance and the haunting knowledge that some journeys change you in ways you never expected and can never undo. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and leave a like. That way, you'll always be with us discovering the secrets and untold sides of the most famous lives in history.